This is Sean. I'm talking today about Stage 2 meaningful use rules. This is optional. Nobody has to watch this. In fact, I've presented this almost 20 times. Karen Sopcich and I have already, and you might have heard it if you attend a board meeting or physician council or various committees. Also, the practice directors invited me to make the rounds, and I visited the majority of the offices. I presented this. I know a lot of providers were unable to attend those noontime meetings, so many of you haven't seen or heard this. So if you're interested in what rules we're up against, feel free to watch. If you ever want to read the actual rules, they're certainly available. This is a copy of the Federal Register from 2010, which told us Stage 1 rules. There's a similar document for Stage 2 rules. It's about 280 pages of fine print, closely spaced. So the first thing you might ask is, what's in it for us? And I'll refer to page 44,442, where it says that EPs, in other words, eligible providers, who are meaningful users during the relevant reporting period, are subject to an incentive payment subject to an annual limit equal to 75% of the state of the Secretary's estimated Medicare allowed charges for furnished services. That sounds pretty generous. 75% of what you're going to get paid for Medicare will come to you as an incentive. However, let me find another section that tells what those limits are. Here it is on the next page, the incentive limits. So really, no matter how much Medicare revenue you generate, the maximum you can get is $18,000 the first year, $12,000 the next year, $8,000 the next year, $4,000 the next year, $2,000 the last year. So that's what the Medicare program reimburses for providers. We'll get to hospital later. But you know, there's a parallel program. There's the Medicaid program. How do they calculate reimbursement on that? Well, it's 85% of the net average allowable costs of the electronic record that you purchased. So do we submit our bills and show what we purchased? No. The government has done that calculation for us, and they came to a conclusion of what the average practice would spend to acquire electronic records. There's a lot of commentary in the Federal Register, and people comment that they don't think that these calculations are fair, that they probably grossly underestimate the actual costs, especially when you consider training time and other losses. However, the Medicaid program comes out a little more generously. So here's a slide you might remember from 3 years ago that just shows all those payments laid out. If a person got into the program and met meaningful use in the year 2011 or 2012 for the Medicare program, they could have earned the full incentives, which amounted to $44,000. Those who first started in 2013 lost $5,000. Those who first start this year have lost $20,000. If you start next year, no incentives. And for those of us that haven't already started in these years, we're already starting to create penalties for ourselves in 2016, 2017, and beyond. We'll come back to those penalties in a minute. The Medicaid program looks more generous. You can earn up to $64,000 almost, and it doesn't seem to decrease over the years. However, most of us are not eligible for the Medicaid program. To be eligible, we have to have 30% of the volume of our practice in Medicaid patients. So who really is eligible for meaningful use? Well, it's all the MDs and DOs, the chiropractors, dentists, Nurse practitioners only if they have 30% of their practice in Medicaid. Otherwise, they're not eligible for either program. Optometrists. Physician assistants are not eligible at all. The midwives are eligible, again, if they have 30% of their practice volume in Medicaid. So right from the start, some of us aren't even eligible, even if we follow the rules carefully and completely. What does this look like in real numbers? A little spreadsheet I've been keeping. If any of you are curious, I can show you item by item, provider by provider. But for the year 2012, the providers found in the Medicaid program, the Medicare program, the e-prescribing program, which was ending, and some other grants, we generated $755,000 in incentives. The hospital, meanwhile, generated, the hospital can participate in both Medicaid and Medicare program. Another $380,000 for the Medicaid program and $1.9 million for the Medicare program. A total of about $3 million. Last year, our reimbursement went down even though more of us were live. Why is that? Well, it's the nature, as you recall from the previous slide, of the descending payments. Even if you're doing things right, you get reimbursed less this year than you did last year. Same for the hospital, for a total of $2.3 million. Next year, even if we do things right, we'll be down to $1.4 million. The year after that, $750,000, and so on. Now remember, I said previously that some of these calculations to determine how much we get reimbursed are the government's design to help us offset the cost of acquiring the electronic record in the first place. So this never has been bonus money. In fact, as you read the fine print of the Federal Register, you realize that even if you do everything perfectly, and even if their calculations are completely correct, in the end, you'll still have to pay 15% of the cost of acquiring the electronic record. So why bother? It's a system that sets you up to lose money. Well, the reason you bother is this. What would a 5% penalty look like? Well, these are the Medicare net revenues for last year. $42 million for the hospital, $11 million for the providers, another $3.3 million for the cancer center, which is a separate corporation. What if we had to suffer a 5% penalty on those? Here are the numbers: $2.1 million for the hospital, $500,000 for the providers, almost $200,000 for the cancer center. Comes to $2.8 million in total. So if we mess up this year and we face a 5% penalty in 2016, that's the kind of losses we'll be looking at. That pretty much eats up our profit margin. Here's another tricky thing. So the government says they're going to give us a 1 to 3% penalty in 2015 if we're not meeting meaningful use in 2013. And the year after that, 2015, we get a 3 to 5% penalty. They haven't published what happens beyond that. One is left to infer that maybe you lose another 2% every year. So after a period of time, you're getting no Medicare reimbursement. So I'm not saying we're doing this entirely for the money. We'll talk about improved patient care as we go on. But you can see that basically our arms are twisted up behind our backs. And the system is set up that if you don't play along, then you're just going to get paid less and less in the future. And it'll hurt. Okay, so next year, since we did not all start at the same time, 14 of us will be in our first 90 days of stage 1 meaningful use. This includes the psychiatrists and other providers at the Family Counseling Center, because they're just getting their electronic record and installed and built now. And it includes 2 mid-level providers who, through no fault of their own, did not meet certain quality measures in 2013, so they have to start over. And 2 more providers who first went live in 2014. Additionally, 15 of us who went live with Stage 1 last year for the first 90 days met all the criteria. I have to meet the criteria for a full year in 2014. So that brings us up to 29 providers. And then the remaining 32 of us are moving on to Stage 2 rules, which you're about to hear about. Incidentally, there's over 2 dozen of us who just aren't eligible. Earlier we talked about how, for instance, if you're a nurse practitioner and you don't have a high volume of Medicaid in your practice, you're not eligible. Nobody's fault, just the way the program is designed. The audiologist is not eligible. The folks in the cancer center aren't eligible because technically the cancer center is hospital-based, even though it's across the street at Stevenson. And hospital-based providers aren't eligible. And that also includes, by the way, the pathologists, the radiologists, the anesthesiologists, the hospitalists. Now, here are the rules. This is a cheat sheet. We can look at that big 300-page Federal Register document, but the government also puts this out. And one way I could present the rules would just be to scroll through this rule by rule and talk about each one. I'm showing you the eligible provider rules, in other words, what we follow in the office. There's a very similar list for the hospital. And if you'd like to view this website, I'm happy to share it with you. If you want to read details on any of these things, you can expand and get into the details to read the actual rule. You know, sometimes these rules are hard to interpret when you've gone to attorneys more than once to help sort things out. Other times we've found that the rules as written here don't exactly mesh with what's written in the Federal Register. Well, they're written by humans. Errors and weird things creep in. So there would be nothing wrong in presenting these rules as they're laid out here. This is the document that we refer to umpteen times a week. The reason I don't is they're laid out in kind of a weird order. There's a bit of randomness to it. And I tried to put a little bit of logic behind how I present these things.